welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're returning to the topic of rationality. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas, so be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. As I've mentioned before, there is no topic that we get as much listener feedback to as rationality. It feels like this is the topic where some people absolutely check out. They're like, get back to me when you interview, like a rabbi who's a surfer who came from, some wild home and whose child is now some artist. Like, get back to me for intergenerational divergence. I'll see you in a year, which I totally understand and respect. We do different topics. We deliberately do different topics. Hopefully nobody gets bored, but also I think in order to address religious life, in order to really be able to understand the totality of religious life, you have to have some conversations that are head-on discussions of theology, and you also need other conversations that are more about life itself, because so much of religious life is not arriving at some particular refining some ideology or theology, though that's a part of it, but it's also about having a healthy and holistic approach to life itself. The quote that always comes to mind for me is what Alex Clare said last year in our Teshuvah series, where he said, first you have to be healthy, then happy, and then holy. And sometimes we talk about things that allow people to be healthy. Sometimes we talk about things that allow people to be happier. And sometimes we talk about things that really refine the idea of what holiness is, what Torah is, what God is. And I think all of these are always in conversation together in 1840. But we do have a lot of people reach out. I'm doing my very, very best to keep up with the correspondence. Hopefully we'll be able to have an episode just about reader responses to each specific topic. So I don't think we're going to have time to do it this round, but I want to read a few emails that we've gotten to introduce our conversation today, which I am so excited about. So I received an email that says as follows: in your return to rationalism, I would love to hear you address not just the more abstract questions about Har Sinai and Revelation, but also the more binding questions about Talmud and Halacha, given that the more rabbinic perspectives of Judaism seem more transparently human. At least those are the sorts of questions that have always bothered me most from a rationalist perspective. We obviously acknowledge the role of humans in the halachic process, although, he writes in parentheses, the process and the role of humans in it is commanded in the Torah. If examined from a more academic perspective, halacha seems to evolve over time and could be seen as impacted by the context in which it has been codified. In Persia, thousands of years ago, without much input from women, etc., etc. Further, there are aspects of the Talmud which we do not use for psak, or meaning Jewish law, or not necessarily having the same level as divinity, and in parentheses, particularly around medical advice. And this is a fantastic email. It means that we're doing our job, but not completely at 1840, because I think part of what we gain by having these series and not doing a more sequential from beginning to end is that we're able to touch on a lot of these points and questions, but not all in one place. And what I kind of lament, and this is really a lot of the theme about today's conversation, is that after recording the interview today with Dr. Malka Simkovich, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. God should forgive me. Dr. Malka Simkovich should forgive me. I do apologize for that. But I will say that right after I recorded the interview, I realized this needed its own series, a series on the early emergence of Torah Shebaal Peh, what we talk about, whether it's called early Judaism, ancient Judaism, we talk a lot about that, and really taking you from kind of the world of prophecy into the world that we live in today, which is much of our interview discusses about this and how you relate to the more human, or I would say the way divinity unrolls and reveals itself through human interpretation, through the interpretation over the generations, through the larger body of Knesset Yisroel. This question has never bothered me because actually the place where I find God the most is in this kind of abstract notion of Knesset Yisrael, the entirety of the Jewish people as revealed through the generations. And while being human, I think in totality, when you take it at its whole, that is where I find God more than anything else. In a way, and this is going to get me absolutely destroyed, but in a way, it parallels in a more mystical, less secularized version of a little bit of what Mordechai Kaplan was talking about. Obviously, Mordechai Kaplan is not a figure that we necessarily hold up, certainly not in traditional Judaism, and we can do a long series on the Reconstructionist movement. I'm tabling that, and we have a flurry of emails with suggestions of future topics. I want to talk about different denominations, particularly Reconstructionist Judaism, which came obviously from the doubt and the struggles of Mordechai Kaplan, which I've given many classes on. I'm absolutely fascinated by. But this notion of the totality of the Jewish people being a repository for revelation is something that I've gleaned out in a little bit from his writings. I'm not blaming this on him, nor am I holding him up. But as Stephen Rode Gottlieb, who was our guest last week, wrote in his essay, there is some pathway that you're sometimes able to find through his writings that actually parallel in many ways mystical writings about that body of Knesset Yisrael. The other topics that he mentioned, obviously halacha. We did a series on halacha, and there's a lot we spoke about there, particularly about what the role of halacha is and how we're able to find kind of divinity in the very human protections and interpretations that much of halacha represents, though not all of halacha. I got a little bit of slack for being overly humanistic in my understanding of halacha, but really through everything that I find, even the sociological things that we do in Judaism, I find a measure of divinity there. I really, really do. The last thing that he mentions, which is really two different questions. One is about the development of the Talmud in Persia without much input from women. This is a major question, and a scholar, a frum scholar, I'm going to mention her name, Miriam Kosman, emailed me that this must be a topic, and she is absolutely right. Dr. Miriam Kosman, I believe she finished her PhD, and this really requires a whole nother topic to unpack, and one that I'm absolutely committed to do. Unfortunately, or fortunately, thank God, people are listening and they're paying attention, but we are not able to keep pace of all the things that we need to get to, and hopefully we'll be able to get to more with your continued listening and your continued support. We'll be able to cover everything one day, and we'll close up shop, throw up two peace signs, and say that's the end of it. The last thing that he said about aspects of the Talmud that we do not consider authoritative for psak, this is another subject that absolutely fascinates me, and one that we have touched upon in our interview in our series on Science and Torah with Rabbi Dr. Meir Tribitz. Rabbi Tribitz has a very innovative approach to this. I actually had a little bit of a hard time swallowing it. He doesn't feel that these parts of the Torah that just have, advice or medical ideas and solutions are actually Torah at all. I think it merits an entire conversation to understand what is Torah, which is a conversation that I, in fact, had on our dear friend and my cousin, Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg's podcast, Behind the Bima. That interview was really a slugfest between me and him, a loving slugfest, as all slugfests that I am involved in are, of course, about the definition and parameters of Torah. It happens to be the topic that I spoke about on Shavuos night. How do we even define what Torah is and is not? The fact that it is not authoritative yet is still canonized in the Talmud. What role does this in fact serve, and what does that tell us about the authority of the Talmud in general? That's a major, major question. So I really appreciated this email. It highlighted some of the things we've touched upon, some of the things we still need to get back to and deal with more sequentially, and I hope, God willing, we'll be able to have a series that focuses on just that. I want to read another email that came from a friend. I'm not going to say his name. He did give me permission to read it, and it is one of the most moving and heartening emails that I have ever gotten and received. It's a little bit long, and I hope you'll bear with me. It's extraordinarily powerful, and I want to read it with you now. Your 1840 podcasts have moved me, admittedly quite unexpectedly, and I wanted to express my gratitude. Thank you for having the difficult, necessary conversations I didn't know I needed to hear. This was supposed to be a 10-second email, then it turned into a Megillah. My apologies. It's therapeutic for me to write this as if someone is going to read it. No pressure at all to read beyond here, and I'd appreciate it if you kept it between us, as I'm not very open about this aspect of my life. He gave me permission to share some of this. I'm not going to say his name. I guess I feel a kind of kinship with you via your podcast, as odd as that may sound. I became aware of 1840 when you launched the idea of it in an email email blast from NCSY, but resisted consuming any of your content despite it being repeatedly referenced by friends over the years. Most likely it was out of arrogance. This Adam Grant tweet sums it up, and he has a funny tweet about what type of content we're willing to engage with and how we change our own curiosity. I thought I was smarter, more open-minded, more worldly than the people recommending your content to me. I lacked and maybe still lack humility. I'm reading this because this resonates with me. I mean, anytime anything is popularly consumed, my first reaction is like, no thank you. This is not for me. And I appreciated this admission because it resonated more than anything else with me in this email. It's hard to create content that is able to resonate in a wide scale, but that also has some nuance, sophistication. It's what we strive to do. We don't always nail it. And I almost think if 1840 was recommended to me, I probably wouldn't listen to it. It'd be, be like, no, thank you. Like, I have fancy books to read. I'm not listening to some podcasts, and I listen to very few podcasts. So I do appreciate that. He calls out a bunch of podcasts, has some very nice things to say about me, which I very much appreciate it. But then he talks about what he is grappling with. There is one topic I have personally been struggling with for quite some time now and has impacted me on both the spiritual and practical religious level. I bring this personal vulnerability up with you, basically a stranger, because 2 of your interviews briefly touched upon it, and I was hoping would expound upon it, but didn't. We're not totally strangers to one another, and you might kill me. I'm not going to give you any information for who this is, but we're not totally strangers. I think if we saw each other in the street, we would definitely say hi to one another, even before this email. I think we would say hi, probably be like a nod, or like maybe I would give like one of those salutes. I sometimes salute people I don't totally know, but I don't think we would just walk by each other. He continues. First for me was your interview with Chaim Seiman. This was part of the Talmud series, where he mentioned that the early Christians were already questioning Torah Shebaal Peh and the focus on laws and ritual. I know nothing about that time period. And your interview with Ari Bergman, where you guys discuss how people were given the authority to apply meaning to the Torah, to use specific rules to extend rather than invent the law. The Chaim interview scared me. Am I an early Christian? And the Ari Bergman interview left me wondering how someone so intelligent, learned, and honest sounding, I don't know him, could make that assumption without providing some sort of grounded basis for it. I just thought it begged to be explored more and was hoping you'd ask him more about that foundational belief, but you didn't. But that is probably my bias because of my current journey. I'm going to pause here on this. Number one, he's absolutely right. I should have pushed Ari much more on this, and I want to say 2 things. Number one, I love Ari. He's my number one teacher. On this particular interview, and he's one of the only guests that we've had on twice already, I remember there was a scheduling issue and he came a little bit late. I'm not blaming him, but I remember the interview felt very rushed. Anytime I sit with Ari, my preference is to sit for 5 hours and just talk forever. Obviously, his book, The Formation of the Talmud, Scholarship and Politics in Yitzchak Isaac Halevi's Doros HaRishonim, which you can download for free from degruyter.com. Degruyter.com is spelled DEGRUYTER.com, which talks all about the development and the authority of the Talmud. It's both a modern and an old story, hovers, in the turn of the millennium in the first to 8th, 9th centuries, and also talks about the founding of the Aguda and how those 2 stories interconnect. Absolutely fabulous book and a must read for those who want to go more in depth. Ari also published a paper which people I don't think have read about different approaches to how drushos work, particularly in the school of thought of the Vilna Gaon. The other thing I would mention for people who want to hear more from Ari on this is that he does have a website, which is aribergman.net. Ari Bergman is ARIBERGMANN.net. 2 N's in Bergman, gets them every single time. And you really want to check there. He has a long series on the development of the oral law. And I hope one day we are able to develop with Ari a special series on this that really takes you from the turn of the century and goes through the history, the academics, all of the controversies, and weds it together with some of his incredibly creative Jewish thought that really has made me the Jew that I am today more than anybody else. But let me continue with the email. That was just a brief interlude with some more references from Ari Ari. So here's where I'm at, he continues. I believe in God without proof for his existence. I believe in the divinity of the Torah without proof of its divine origins. I have not yet been able to articulate why I believe in those things, but it's likely a combination of a Pintel Yid, Hasidus in general, something I have a weird relationship with, but I don't know how else to describe the feelings about God and the Torah and chosenness of the Jewish people. And two, why he believes in revelation, the complexity, awesomeness, and novelty of the Torah. Similar to how Reb Josh Berman described the revolution of the Torah in its historical context on your podcast back when we discussed biblical authorship. But I had never really articulated it that way before, more just had a sense of how it's either created by God or a Renaissance man in a cave, and the former seems more likely to me because I'm skeptical a human could create it. So what does he struggle with? The email continues, and pardon me for reading this, but I think it's really, really important. I struggle with the authority of the rabbis, whether that authority is divine or as a sort of populist movement created by the people for the people. I struggle with authority, rabbinic or otherwise. I don't care for people who unilaterally tell me what to do or how to live. So I've been on a journey of trying to get to a belief that the practical Orthodox Judaism we know today is what God wants and is intended for. I'm not convinced that's the case. As I've explored this topic, I think that the core issue for me is believing in Torah Shebaal Peh being given at Har Sinai along with Torah Shebechsav, and B, the unbroken chain of Masorah, the Torah Shebaal Peh, until it was codified and canonized in the Mishnah and the Talmud and beyond. Now that's really complicated, and I responded obviously with an email and something that we can unpack more. I'm not sure what we mean necessarily when he says Torah Shebechsav means the written law. We know what that means. That's from Bereshis till the end of Vizos HaBracha, most notably maybe also the writings of the prophets and other writings. But Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, means a lot of things. And not all of it was given at Sinai. That the Rambam, Maimonides, is clear about in his introduction to Perush HaMishnayos. How we extrapolated on the written law to create the oral law is something we must get into, and I have not done a good enough job kind of taking you from point A to point B. And I think our listeners have done a better job figuring out the holes over the course of this entire 1840 journey of saying, you're still missing these pieces. I mean, Mitch, my partner in all of this, reminds me of this literally every single week. But we do need to do a better job to take you sequentially from point A to point B and say, how did this develop? As a parenthetical, it continues, I understand there are many facets to Torah Shebaal Peh. The 1906 Jewish Encyclopedia characterized into 8 different groups, so there may be different explanations to each, and I may be willing to accept that some of these were actually given at Har Sinai. As I mentioned, this is exactly what the Rambam says. The big question is, of course, that most of the drushas we find in the Talmud, the Rambam, against the earlier sages known as the Gaonim, feels that they were created, they were constructed by the rabbis rather than retrieving them from Sinai. That debate, that conversation is one of the most important conversations in the development of the oral law. We have some resources on this when we discussed Talmud in general, but probably not enough. Jay Harris's book, which we linked to when we discussed, I think, Halacha, his book is called How Do We Know This, also details a lot of these discussions as well. I've been trying to understand, he continues, the historical context of Torah Shebaal Peh and what was known and debated and practiced prior to its canonization. What did practical Judaism look like? If Torah Shebaal Peh was passed down from Har Sinai, I would think our practical Judaism would look more similar to what it did in ancient and medieval times. For example, was Shabbos then what it is today? Or was it just that you couldn't walk too far, you couldn't light a fire, you couldn't carry, couldn't do your weekday work? But the 39 malachas learned from the malacha in the Mishkan were not usser. This is he's suggesting. Because of my cynicism and skepticism of authority, I put together a story in my mind of how our practical religion may have been conceived by genius, power-rich rabbis who were looking to protect their way of life. Basically, the Perushim were battling with other Jewish sects for primacy in the Second Temple and post-Second Temple times. Different sects had different beliefs as to what was divine and what wasn't, what was central to the religious experience and what was just fringe, etc. The battles were in the interest of power and control over a religious population that was dealing with external, non-Jewish influences, and each sect had different ideas about how to deal with those influences. For a variety of contextual circumstances, the Perushim won, whether that's because of of the influence of Roman leadership, other sects assimilating into other cultures, geographic dispersion, etc., and they won despite them being a relatively small group of Jews. The leaders of the Prussian became known as the rabbis, and they claimed to represent the interests of the middle and lower class people, not the elite, noble, priestly Jews who led other sects and may have been more temple ritual based, i.e. upper class. And they had a dilemma. Again, I'm still reading the email. He's trying to figure out, this is how I understand it. And they had a dilemma. How do we make sure that what happened to other sects didn't happen to us? How do we ensure Jewish continuity without the temple and a central place of worship and community? At the same time, how do we make sure that wherever Jews go, they'll be resistant to Christian and Islamic influences? Let's codify the religion. Let's create a set of rules that we could tie back to the Bible through hermeneutical principles that may have existed in other intellectual cultures to create a daily, monthly, and yearly schedule of ritual and practice so the religion pervades every moment of life. And let's say that the hermeneutical principles were passed down from God at Har Sinai, and the Torah actually gives us the power to do this so we cover our basis. If this is all true, it's ingenious and deserves admiration, and I can even understand that people would be willing to follow it religiously. But for me, as someone who is skeptical of authoritative figures and probably too skeptical of human nature and human goodness, and that needs to be explored in intensive therapy, as with everything else, he writes that in parentheses, gave me a smile, this gives me great pause in accepting so much of what has become front and center in our religious practice, and makes me constantly uncomfortable and phony living the life I'm living. I make all the typical rationalizations to keep doing what I'm doing. A religious Jewish community as a whole is a moral, ethical, and socially charitable environment to raise my kids and live in, so I put on tefillin, I chant the actual words of tefillah as prescribed by the rabbis, I go through the annual holiday rituals, but I do this all with a sense of being dishonest. This email to me, and again, for those who hate my long intros, burn me at the stake, but this email for me really nailed it on the head with what I think so many people struggle with rabbinic authority. It's not malicious. It's really grappling. What are we doing here every day? I've spoken to one rabbinic friend, he continues, about this, and he said in a loving way that he thinks the arrogance which I'm projecting onto the rabbis is well a projection, that I'm arrogant thinking I know better than the original rabbis were ill-intentioned, and that they deviated from the divine script even if they were doing something righteous by saving their religion. And the way history has played out, that we exist today as Orthodox practicing Jews in the numbers and population and various geographies that we do, shows that we are a people of the book, both biblical and rabbinic, that the education and Torah Shebaal Peh centric, the oral law centric religion we've become is true and divinely ordained, and couldn't exist today if not for the hand of God directing history through the Prushim and the rabbis and the canonization of religious practice and the shift of focus from the temple to education, etc., etc. I have not yet accepted this. It doesn't satisfy me. I'm looking for something more concrete, something more historical, something to dispel my conspiracy theory about what actually happened, and a better understanding of what biblical religious practice looked like. There is one thing I found this week in an article by Rabbi Tzvi Friedman on Chabad.org, where he says, almost as a parenthetical, that the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was that the Sadducees were an elite class removed from the common people, where the Pharisees were well integrated with the working class. Apparently has his roots in Josephus. Most were working people themselves, and this is why the Romans saw the Prushim, the Chachamim, as the only true representatives of the Jews at the time and chose to deal exclusively with them. He says this from Lawrence Schiffman's book, From Text to Tradition. Essentially, the Prushim were a populist movement, which was revolutionary at the time, considering the eliteness of the Sadducees and the class structure of Greek, Roman, and other ancient cultures. Is this accurate? If so, it's worth me exploring further, because it could help me alleviate some of my concerns of the efforts being driven by basic human desires for influence and power. Either way, so I'm wondering if you could help maybe point me in the right direction. And then he lists the following questions. 1. What are the earliest sources for the existence of Torah Shebaal Peh? That means the oral law. 2. What are the best sources for the divinity of Torah Shebaal Peh? 3. What are the sources for the unbroken chain of transmission, not just that it exists and is a fundamental belief in our faith, like the Rambam's introduction to Mishnayos and the Igaris of Reb Shri Ragon, which I haven't read and I'm looking for a copy in Rabinowitz English. You could find it in English. But he wants to, what are the sources for this unbroken transmission? 4. What are the sources for the divinity of Rabbi Yishmael's 13 principles, of which basically all of Torah analysis and debate is based upon? These are the hermeneutical principles that we create drushos with. Are these divine, or were they appropriated from other cultures or created by the OG rabbis? For those keeping score at home, that's the second time, I believe, that we've used the term OG in the context of rabbis. Again, OG, for those of our OG listeners, means original gangsters. And obviously the OG listeners may not be familiar with the term OG. Doesn't matter. And finally, 5, are there accounts, Torah-based or archaeological, historical, of what practical Jewish religious observances was like before everything was canonized? I know this is a heavy email covering many different topics, and I have zero expectations for you to read it or address any of it. It was helpful for me to formulate my thoughts and deliver it to someone with the thought that it would be read by someone much more scholarly than me. If you've gotten to this point, thank you so much for reading. Regardless, thank you so much for 1840. Keep having the difficult conversations. So I want to say 2 things. I'm obviously not going to say this person's identity, but it's not who you think it is. Meaning, in your mind, I'm sure a lot of people read this email and they're thinking what this person looks like. It's not who you think it is. That much I am nearly 100% sure of. This person looks like exactly you and I. Whatever you look like, this person looks like. It is not somebody who's walking in the street with, old manuscripts and scrolls and, tattered shirt and trying to figure out. This is a person who looks, sounds, and whose life looks like you and I. I really, really mean that. And that's important to know. And number 2, this is a clarion call. A, for the work of 1840, the work of the 1840 community, for our listeners who are listening to this and have resources and have ideas. I am 100% committed to going through and getting the very best approaches to answer and respond to this email. I don't even like the word answer. I frankly don't like the word respond. Maybe to address, to be in dialogue with these questions. I think it needs to be done more thoughtfully, not as much in conversation, and really from beginning to end. How did the Judaism we know today come to be? And I think there is a way to do this. I think there's a way to do this with blending kind of the 1840, more populist, more, for the people approach without feeling like you're going through thousands of pages of academic books, but at the same time can have signposts in the road to tell people who are struggling with this, because a lot of people are. Not everyone is, but a lot of people are. Not everyone is able to just slap the "Thank you Hashem" bumper sticker on their car and say, this is wonderful, this is great. Some people are really grappling with the truth in all of this, and it is a privilege to be a recipient of an email like this, really from the bottom of my heart. And I am committed to really figuring out a better way to address this from beginning to end, more sequentially. And I'm really calling upon our listeners to make suggestions. What's the best way to go about this? I think something in text, a specific series, and it's why I am so excited for our guest today. Dr. Malka Simkovich teaches in Catholic Theological Union and is really an expert on what she calls early Judaism, I believe. I think some call it ancient Judaism. Nobody likes being called ancient. She is a phenomenal scholar, really, really a wonderful person whose expertise is on this early question. And my biggest regret, frankly, is that not enough of our conversation together addresses these points. And I wish they did. I think some of it does, but more of it should have. And God willing, if she's willing, and she doesn't swear off 1840 and say never, ever again, which I hope none of our guests do, but I'm always worried some of them will, we absolutely are going to return to a second conversation with her and other scholars, particularly in this area, to start building this sequential path, really from this grand transition from prophetic Judaism, as it is sometimes called, to rabbinic Judaism. And that is a journey that we begin today with our conversation with Dr. Malka Simkovich. I'm so excited to have you as a guest, Dr. Malka Simkovich. I always ask my guests, it's a running joke in our podcast, are you comfortable with me calling you Malka?
Yes, you can absolutely. Please call me Malka. Sometimes my kids call me Malka.
And you are the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the Director of Catholic Jewish Studies Program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, which is really just like a fascinating place to be situated. It's not the universe and the world that you grew up in. And what I really want to talk about today to begin with is an email that you and I both received from our mutual friend, Jeff Bloom, who wrote an absolutely fascinating book called, and I might butcher the title, I'm not going to go out of frame to get the book, Strauss, Spinoza, Sinai, and Revelation. And he sent us both an email. We both had the same response. The email was essentially asking us to weigh in about how would you ground your faith in modernity? In this dialogue, this imagined dialogue between Leo Strauss, the philosopher, and Spinoza, neither of which you really need to know about to have this conversation, to understand our conversation, but basically saying religion in the modern world has not been disproved, so to speak, so we should continue with our religious commitment even through modernity. And I'm overly paraphrasing, and you could step in if you think you want to phrase it differently. Mm-hmm. And he reached out to both of us, asking us if we wanted to write an essay for this collected volume with all these wonderful thinkers, so many of whom have been guests on 1840, about how you ground your faith. And this was a topic that we discussed previously when we spoke about, is religion rational, about what is the methodology that you use to ground your faith, but neither of us responded. Malka, let me begin. Why didn't you respond? Why didn't you contribute, especially the volume, many have noted, and Jeff himself is kind of, frustrated by, there are not that many women contributors. Why didn't you respond? Why didn't you make a contribution talking about how you ground your faith?
First of all, can I call you David?
Oh, that is too kind of you. Yeah, please, I insist on it.
All right, David. So first of all, I responded right away. I, like the minority, I suppose, of academics, did not reply all. I responded directly to Jeff. And I did say that this is out of my purview. It's out of my comfort zone. Anything past the 5th or 6th century for me is very dim. I like to work in the field that I'm comfortable with.
And let me just jump in. What is your primary field? Ancient Judaism? Is that how you would describe it?
We like to say early Judaism because ancient sounds a little antiquated or irrelevant. But yes, ancient, early Judaism. So that would be the 4th century BCE till around the 4th century CE. It's the nexus of early Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, early Christianity, past the 4th century, like I said, it all gets a little dark. And certainly if you're, going to ask for contributors on a book about questions that Strauss was asking, I did not feel like I would be the ideal candidate for such a book. But when I reached out to Jeff, he did push back. And he said, I'm focused on the questions and not the discipline around Strauss and his life and writings specifically. And I just felt a little skeptical of that. And so I said, let's keep up a relationship, but you need to find somebody else for this book.
I don't know if you feel comfortable sharing. We spoke briefly earlier and you shared with me a fascinating theory about the gender differences, about how people respond to questions outside of their field. I also responded. I thought the email, and I love Jeff, we had him on, and I just thought the email was absolutely overwhelming. Like, I needed to read it 4 times. I'm like, if I can't understand the invitation to contribute, I don't think I'll be able to make a meaningful contribution. But I was intimidated and I regretted it because I think it's such an important question about grounding your faith. But just share with me, if you're comfortable, you had like a little bit of like a gendered theory about responses to these sort of invitations.
I guess I have to begin by apologizing to the many, many women who do not fall into this gross generalization that I'm about to share. So anecdotally, gender generalizations are never fair or accurate, sometimes a little bit helpful. And my anecdotal experience is that when an invitation lands in the inbox of a woman academic who could be very, very accomplished, and now I'm speaking really for myself and for the friends that I know, unless the person, the woman receiving that invitation really feels confident and in control of the material that she's being asked to produce or to respond to, usually there's a degree of humility that will lead to her to politely refuse. Again, this is anecdotal, but what I've seen is much more, I would say, prominent in the reverse, which is that I have many male colleagues who say yes to everything, whether it's in their wheelhouse or not. There's a certain level of confidence or a sense that, of course, I can go beyond my area of expertise and share my wisdom with the world and everybody will thank me for it. And so again, it's anecdotal, but I tend to say no unless I feel very confident and comfortable. And I have many friends who feel the same way.
I got such a kick out of it because I think I am so guilty of that. Even just like the very notion of 1840, we're having these conversations on all these major different issues. And just me in general, I definitely feel that there is a gendered component, though I don't want to harp on this. I just got a kick out of it because I sometimes see it in myself. Like, David, who asked you to weigh in on, like, what gave you the idea that you should be weighing in on this or that you have the ability to weigh in on this? I think it's definitely something worth thinking about.
Well, I actually think it's a great quality, by the way. I think that the ability to be optimistic about things beyond your comfort zone, I think sometimes the situation calls for you to be be, bold and daring, and to sort of jump out of where you want to be and learn something new and believe in yourself that you can find something that you can share with a broad audience, even if it's not your area. So I think it is a question of balance and checking oneself to know, when are you being arrogant, when are you being realistic. But I think it's a very nice quality to get an invitation and say, this is not my area of expertise, but I want to be a part of it.
Let me shift to, the imagined response. We don't have a response. You didn't contribute. I didn't contribute. But I did want to invite you to respond. And before I kind of hear how you would ground your own faith, I wanted to take you back to some of the responses we got in our first series, because so many of them kind of ended, I wouldn't call it a shrug. I think that that's too pessimistic, but they ended with a shrug of like, look, you can never be completely certain about the truth claims of your religion. You have to approach life from within the framework that you have it. But, it makes sense why somebody born in a Jewish household would choose Judaism and investigate Judaism and find some bounded, rational way to make Judaism work for them. But I'm curious for you, your studies, your focus really is in the period where this question becomes so much more pressing and so much more real. Because when we look back and think about Judaism as this unending broken chain that goes back to Sinai, you really study the evolution and development of the Judaism as we know it, the movement away from a Beis Hamikdash as the center of Jewish life, the temple, what scholars would call the cult practice of the temple, the temple being at the center. Yeah, I see you grimacing. Do you hate that term?
Oof, I don't like it.
I don't like it either. It makes it seem like we're like, I don't know. It makes it sound like a cult, but that's the term that is, I didn't come up with it, right?
I
don't
know.
want to be blamed for that.
You did not come up with it, David. I don't like it, though.
But like a religious life that almost seems unimaginable, like otherworldly, like an ancient world. I know that's not the term you want, but a world with prophecy, a world with open divine revelation as we have it described, into the world as we know it now, which is the world that includes Tanoim and Amoraim, the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and it's the world that we continue to inhabit, the world where God is apprehended not through open miracles and prophecy and sacrifices, but a God that is apprehended through kind of our own sense of self and thought and analysis and contending with a tradition that obviously came through revelation within our religious practice. But it's the world we inhabit. And I wonder, for somebody who studies this period and this transition and lives and identifies with the Orthodox world, is the contentions of how you justify the life you live different? You saw a very real change from the prophetic world described in the Bible to the world that was, and I'm using delicate terms, constructed, so to speak, through the Mishnah and through the Talmud that we have now. I'll end my question, which was, it's unwieldy, but I want to hear you on this. My Rebbe when I was in Ner Yisrael was Rebbe Ezra Neuberger, and Rebbe Ezra, as he is affectionately called, one time told us, and I remember this so clearly, that the people around the Shabbos table, we have more in common with the greatest of the Tanoim and Amoraim than with a common peasant living at the time of prophecy. What did he mean by that? I think he meant that the operative universe that we inhabit now shares a clear link, the way that we anchor our own sense of self with the world of the Mishnah and the Gemara, than the prophetic world that somebody inhabited in the time of, Har Sinai, in the time of Avraham Avinu. It was a different experiential universe, what Karl Jaspers calls the axial age, the shift away from that. So I'm curious for you, who studies this period and sees how different religions maybe influence one another, who sees a clear shift in the way the universe operated, what effect does that have, and how would you respond to that question of how you ground your own faith?
Wow. So that was many, many questions, and I'm not sure where to start. As you were speaking a few minutes ago, I was not thinking that I would ground my answer in the world of Second Temple Judaism. So I'm going to start by just speaking more in a contemporary lens, and then maybe I will bring it back to how my ideas have been impacted by the scholarship that I do. So first of all, I think that we're at a very critical point right now. I mean, I'm sure that every generation of Jews says that, but I think that the time is ripe. The conversations that I'm hearing, particularly as they're happening in the centrist and modern Orthodox communities, really, I think people are asking for a revision of the answers to an ancient question, which is, what do we believe and what do we need to believe, right? What does an observant Jew need to believe? And so we know the Ani Mamins, right? We have our list of, things. Of course, these are centuries and centuries old, these lists of what you have to believe. And I wonder whether we can and should think about, I don't want to say, starting all over again, but what would it look like if we reconsidered what in the 21st century means to be an observant Jew? So what do we need to believe? And I think very often what I see in my own community and what I see my children learning in school is that one of the most important things that an observant Jew needs to believe in is that God wrote every single word of the Tanakh or the Torah. I mean, the Tanakh, that's ridiculous. Even the Gemara doesn't say that God wrote every word of the Tanakh, but I do think that it's sort of inculcated in my children, for example, that every word in the Tanakh is, to use a phrase that they've never heard, divinely sanctioned. But the point is that the divinity of the Torah is very, very central, I think, to a lot of what's happening pedagogically in our community. And I've been trying to think about what would it look like if we maybe marginalized or sort of peripheralized that and said, okay, let's just start from the beginning. What do we need to believe? I believe in God, right? And the second most important belief that I have has nothing to do with the written or oral scriptures. It has to do with chosenness. It has to do with election, with covenant. I believe that there is a special, unique relationship that hinges on mystery. In other words, God entered into the physical realm, nurtured this relationship with the people of Israel that he cherishes. This choosing is mysterious. In other words, I can't say why God chose Israel. And it's inherently problematic.
Why is it problematic?
Once you start talking about chosenness and election and covenant, you're already on the precipice of something that is chauvinistic, right? Of something that sets the people of Israel apart in a way that makes them so special that you can't sort of undermine the sense of superiority of the people of Israel, right? Chosenness is a really, really problematic idea. And yet I think that it has to be contended with in a way that people in our community, what I've seen again anecdotally, is that we just take it for granted. Of course, we're the chosen people. What do you mean? Like, what is there else to say? God chose us. We're, in this covenantal relationship. Duh, obviously. But I think that if we were to step back and say, what does it mean to believe in a special covenantal relationship? And how does that impact the way that I move throughout the world? That to me would yield much more interesting answers than a teacher yelling at a classroom of kids that God wrote every word of the Torah.
So interesting. I think your depiction about the centrality of the divinity of the Torah is found much more in modern Orthodox schools. There's like more hand-wringing about that. And I think that there has been a shift, particularly in the Hasidic community and the yeshiva community, not in the theology of the chosenness of the Jewish people, but that as the primary underpinning. And I think it's beginning to trickle down in modern schools too. I think if you go into a modern school in the tri-state area, I don't want to mention names, my school, I went to DRS. Kids don't know a lick about the issues related to biblical criticism. It's like the most feared subject, one that we've discussed to a great deal of controversy on 1840, but they can sing without any, deep knowledge, but they do sing Geschmack to be a Yid. And I think that we build a lot of culture around the uniqueness of a Jew without grappling with why would you ever think it's problematic? What makes a Jewish person unique? And I think those questions bubble up when people are no longer in exclusively Jewish environments and see that non-Jews are also wonderful and decent. So it's like, okay, like I guess it's Geschmack, so it's like Chulin and like I guess, pre-gaming Friday night, whatever you associate your Geschmackness with. They're not dealing with the theological problematic aspect of it, but I want you to continue because it's such an interesting starting point. Why is chosenness so important? Please continue.
Well, actually, this does bring me to what you were trying to do in your first question, which is to ground it historically. I think that the idea of chosenness is maybe even more, I don't want to say endemic, but sort of deeply, deeply embedded in our oldest texts, right? So chosenness, even before you have a concept of divinely written Torah, whatever the Torah would have meant in the Second Temple period is also up for debate. But chosenness, you can't open up the Torah and get away from this idea, right? Even if you think that the Torah was written by people and there's some divine guiding hand, but maybe God did not write every single word, but still the idea of chosenness, it's so endemic to who we are and it goes beyond the scriptures. But I would also just try to reframe what you were just saying because you were thinking about this as a problem. And I don't know that chosenness election is, I would say it's not a problem. I would say it's a question, right? And so do you need, as an observant Jew, to answer every question? I think we live in a very intellectual world, right? Post-Enlightenment, we're living in a society where questions are meant to invite pursual. And here's where a little bit I borrow from my Christian colleagues. And this, I would say, I am deeply influenced by the context in which I've been working for the past 10 years. I don't know that we need to answer every question. And I think that the category of mystery, rather than being a sort of source of embarrassment, right? If you say we have problems in our theological framework, then it's almost like you're admitting this embarrassing flaw in your tradition that you can't get around. But what if you framed it as this is a truth claim that we make, and there are questions within this truth claim that we approach through the lens of mystery. In other words, we're limited. Our human brains cannot transcend the realm of the physical. We'll never know what it is to think like God, to act like God, to be God. And so that is where humanity meets the divine, right? We will not know. That's okay, right? So is it a problem or is it a question?
You say that you've been influenced from your Christian colleagues in the role of mystery. What do you mean by that? Are Christians more mysterious? Do they wear disguises? What are you drawing from?
I'm just a little dilettante in the world of Catholic theology. I don't even know. I'm just barely scratching the surface here. But there are truth claims made, and now I'm speaking specifically about Catholic theology, when it comes to the nature of God and God's relationship. I'm just going to say it, David, with Christ. And of course, I don't believe in the messiahship of Jesus, but I'm saying Christ. So what is the nature, right, of the Trinity? And there are multiple mysteries in the Catholic tradition. And actually, one of those mysteries is the particular status of the Jewish people. And especially after the Second Vatican Council, I don't want to bore everybody with dates and, the church's history. But in 1965, when the church did suggest that the Jews can be saved outside of faith in Christ, well, there's no way of answering how that works. And so a lot of these documents that talk about the Jews, that are modern documents, talk about it within the framework of mystery. And I read these documents and I think, at first I would just sort of roll my eyes, like, what a lazy way to deal with really interesting questions. But I'm now starting to think that maybe it's not lazy. Maybe there's something very rich that invites investigation, but also mystery has this inherent humility to it, right? It doesn't mean don't look. It doesn't mean don't learn. It just means recognize the limitations with which we work. But just going back to my main idea here, I think the heart of Jewish belief is election. And I actually do think that that's very similar to the Catholic Church as well, because, you're saved through faith, right?
Why isn't election for you, why does it need mystery? Why isn't it an open shut case that he elected us to enlighten the world, what people call tikkun olam, we're a light unto the nations, and our role is taking the word of God and the idea of revelation and spreading it to the world, and we're kind of the messengers, we're the lamplighters, whatever analogy you want to use. Why do you even have to rely on mystery? Why isn't that, it's like an open shut case, tikkun olam, like that's the role and responsibility of the Jewish people?
There are many theologians who say that, yes, Israel was chosen to bring knowledge of God, or whatever you want to call it, ethical monotheism, another phrase that's super problematic. But yeah, there are many theologians who say the Jews were chosen to bring knowledge of God to the world. But why Israel, right? There's a randomness to it. And then, of course, the rabbis retroactively tell us all kinds of stories about the uniqueness of Abraham. But let's say put all that aside. There's just such a randomness to it. Why not anyone else? Why the Abrahamic family? Why us?
It's so interesting, and I really want to get back to almost a more personal ground because I have so many follow-ups. One thing that I want to mention is this is a question that not enough people grapple with, but I think it tugs, for me at least, it's theologically difficult. When I look at a non-Jew solemnly praying to their particular God, do I think they're doing anything, or do I think they're just kind of mumbling? When I look at the decency identity that I see in non-Jews? Like, do I see them as like a different genre, or, some have even used the terrifying term species? Like, to me, it uproots our notions of this universalistic, globalistic world that we live in, that we're sometimes some way better or special or different. And one formulation that I did like, that I'm curious to hear you and how you've contended with it, is the philosopher Michael Wishegrad, who said that part of the purpose of election is to highlight the very importance of particularity itself, of what it means to have a particular love, which I think as a society we're grappling with, where in some ways, during the civil unrest rising, specifically around black rights, there was a lot of conversation about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And to me, like, All Lives Matter is a very Christian framing. It's universal. Everybody counts. And I think what Judaism brings to the world is the importance of a particularistic love, so to speak. Black Lives Matters, Jewish Lives Matters, whatever corner you're in, but the importance of being particularistic as a part of world development and self-development. Does that resonate with you?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So yes, what you're referring to, I think, is this debate between Wishegrad and David Novak about how to understand the Torah. So Novak really doesn't like Wishegrad and argues that you have to read the Torah as bearing a universal message that resonates with all of humankind. Now, of course, he doesn't deny the unique relationship between Israel and God, but there is this universality that's at the core of the Torah's message. And Wishegrad says, no thanks. Like you said, election highlights this particularity of God. And also it's interesting because I did find a passage in one of Wishegrad's books, I don't remember which one, where he actually uses the word mystery, but then leaves it. He doesn't develop it. But basically, even Wishegrad says, look, I don't know why the Jews versus anyone else, but yes, he leans into the particularity of the Torah's story. Now, as for the word universalism, I wrote a book on universalism, and I hate the word now. Like, every time somebody says universal, I just roll my eyes and I get very sleepy. First of all, nobody defines universalism. And I think even in our own community, many of our Jewish friends think about universalism through a Christian lens, by which I mean, like you just said, this value that we can all sort of dissolve the boundaries which separate us and all ultimately work towards this redemptive era during which we're all the same. I don't actually think that that's inherent to our traditions. And if universalism is the openness towards others entering into the covenantal community, well, guess what? That's particularist. Because essentially what you're saying is, unless you convert or you transform into what I am, you will not be saved. And so that's particularism. So we don't define these terms, and I don't mean any disrespect to Lord Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sacks, because this is his favorite word. And, it resonates. People feel good when they think about the universalist message of the Torah. But first of all, there are major definitional problems with this word. And I think that Wishegrad is right to say, listen, particularism and universalism, our first mistake is thinking about these as being in tension with each other. How can you lean into the particularist message of the Torah without undermining what we all know to be true, which is that God is the universal God who cares for all of humankind? So, I think the first step is to not treat these categories like they're in tension with one another. And there's just one other thought that I had. I'm not sure whether I could really tie it into what you just said, but I think that there are many, many members of the Orthodox Jewish community who say, yeah, universalism is fine. It's just not for me, right? Like, my life is particularist, but, you can do, everyone outside of our community, you can, have the interreligious dialogue. You can have the ecumenical dialogue. You could sing Kumbaya in a field of lilies. It's not our thing, but gizim tehei, do whatever you want. But I think that pretty much all, unless you're living under a rock, all observant Jews are contending with the outside world, right? Whether they're doing it consciously or not, there is an engagement with the world out there. There's no way to not form your own identity based on what's outside of it. And so the Orthodox Jews who say to me, well, I don't know why you have to talk to them, right? The Catholics or the Christians or whatever. Isn't it enough for you just to be an observant Jew? And it's a frustrating thing to hear, because I think that what hasn't been recognized is the degree to which we're all thinking with people outside of our own community in our own minds, right? And, that is in a way, a universalist way of thinking, right? All of which is to say that particularism and universalism can lead us down the wrong path. I don't like these categories. I don't think that they're useful. I think that they suggest that there are these things that are pulling us all the time in opposite directions. And I'm very sympathetic towards Wishograd trying to restore the integrity of particularism to our own lives. And I think he is misread. Those who think that he's doing it at the expense of universality, I think he's misread. I don't think that's necessarily true.
Let me continue with your line of thinking, grounding the centrality of the election of the Jewish people. And let me contrast it with the Malka Simkovich that we don't know each other all that well, but the life that you live in 2022. You study texts that describe a world from what you said is the 4th century BCE, 4,000 years before, no, right? BCE, 400 years before the destruction of the temple to
400 or 4,000.
I was saying 400 BCE to 400 CE, but really, because I'm not working with the yeshivish dates that I got from Mrs. Svei, from Rebbetzin Svei in 1998. She was my Tanakh teacher, Chumash teacher. So, really, to be more accurate, I would just say the Second Temple period. So 538 to 70 CE, but a little bit past 70 CE.
Let me articulate the question this way. And Reb Tzadok, who has been the muse of my scholarly interests really since I was, in my early 20s, he really contends with this a great deal as well. You spend your time studying texts and the civilization, the Jewish people around that era, yet you live now as an Orthodox Jew to great financial costs, to great time costs, social costs, and all that stuff in the year 2022. How do you square the fact that near so many of your religious commitments, whether they cost you money or time or focus, but it's a real investment. It's a real investment. How do you square that focus when, if you're spending all of your time in the world that's described in Second Temple period Judaism, that's a tongue twister, it doesn't feel like the Orthodox Judaism that we practice today. It doesn't. Reb Tzadok writes this explicitly about the centering of rabbinic law. It almost seems otherworldly, like that question I began with of having more in common, in terms of the world we inhabit with the Tana and Amora than a common peasant in the world of the flourishing of prophecy. How do you square the life, the Orthodox life you live in 2022 with the world that once existed in the Second Temple era, the First Temple? How do you find it nourishing? Why do you invest all of this time if you really immerse yourself in that academic study, it doesn't require all of this?
It's funny, when I decided to go for a PhD in early Judaism, in Second Temple Judaism, a lot of guys, a lot of male friends in my community who were also thinking, we were in our early mid-20s and also thinking about PhDs, said, if you're going to do a PhD in Jewish history, the only thing that you can really go into is medieval Judaism, because anything else is really heretical. If you do modern, then already you're dealing with, all kinds of heresies and, if you're doing Second Temple period, just forget it. The only thing that's kosher is medieval Judaism, right? Write a dissertation on the Tosfos. And I do have friends who've done that. I actually totally disagree with the premise of that question. And there are so many ways to respond to this. First of all, what does it mean to have a normative Judaism? It didn't just pop up the day that the Second Temple fell, that the rabbis looked around and said, we have no temple. Okay, let's form something out of nothing. And oh, look, here's an oral tradition that just fell from the heavens into our laps, and now we're all living this normative halachic atmosphere. Nothing happens like that. In the Second Temple period, Judaism is, like you implied, experimental, it's playful, it's creative, it's diverse, but there is a core of normative Jewish practice that is ancient, shockingly ancient. So all of our evidence suggests that by the 2nd century BCE, if you were going to identify as a Jew, you would keep kashrut. What does that mean? How did they keep dietary laws? Okay, they didn't keep it in the ways that we keep it today, but there was an oral tradition developing, and they were keeping dietary laws. They were circumcising their sons. They were keeping Shabbat. And by that early stage, there was an oral tradition developing about how to do that. They were gathering regularly to read their scriptures, and probably, again, by the 2nd century BCE, there was a firm Torah, the Pentateuch. The first 5 books were, fixed.
Clearly canonized.
I'm not going to say the same for Ketuvim, for sure. Maybe not for Nevi'im necessarily, but certainly the Torah. And so all of this is to say that there is a core of what we call common Judaism. And what's remarkable about that is that really from the very beginning of the Second Temple period, from the end of the 6th century BCE, Judaism, or what becomes Judaism, is global. In other words, you never have, after the Judeans are kicked into exile in the beginning of the 6th century BC, you never have the Judeans back in one place altogether ever again. So Jews are migrating, Judeans at this stage, they're migrating, they're moving, and yet there's a common memory, right? And now this goes back to what I was saying a half an hour ago. What is the memory? God chose us, right? They're sharing the same stories. They're reading the same scriptures. They're maintaining a cohesiveness, even though there's no internet, there's no phone, right? But they're all over the world, thousands of miles away from each other. And yet they're remaining cohesive, mainly because of this idea, this radical idea that they share scriptures which tell a story, and the story focuses on God's chosenness. And what do these Jews do, whether they're in Alexandria or whether they're in eastern regions by the Tigris or whether they're in Antioch in Syria? What do? They actively and playfully and experimentally interpret the scriptures. And this is the beginning of Midrash. Now, I really think diaspora Judaism gets a horrible reputation, and I blame it all on Hanukkah. Because Hanukkah, my worst holiday, Hanukkah, because Hanukkah enforces this false binary between the Jews in Judea who are preserving the authentic tradition and every other clown outside of Judea who infiltrates the Judean culture with their horrible Hellenism. And this is just not historically accurate. And I want to say one more thing. I know I'm saying a lot of things.
No, I'm fascinated.
Right. Keep going.
But the point that I really want to make is that, so first of all, it's incorrect to say if you were outside of Judea, you were more likely to assimilate, or you were corrupted by Hellenism, or you weren't authentically Jewish. But even if you wanted to assimilate, even if you said, all right, from this day forth, I am no longer Chizkiyahu, I'm Aristobulus, right? You are no longer living as a Jew. And this is very resonant for 2022. Even if you wanted to assimilate, the Greeks didn't let you. The Romans didn't let you. So we have evidence of Jews who are apostates, Jews who are abandoning the observance of ancestral laws outside of Judea and in Judea. And no matter what these Jews do, guess what? The Greeks and the Romans are still treating them as Jews, outsiders, misanthropists. And we know that in the year 38 CE, there were anti-Jewish pogroms in the city of Alexandria, the city where maybe there was the highest level of cultural assimilation on the part of Jews. Again, I'm never going to go so far as to say that all the Jews of Alexandria were assimilated. That's just not true. But they were acculturated. They participated in all aspects of society. They were involved in politics. They were involved in culture and art and theater. And that's the heart of anti-Jewish violence in 38 CE.
And that's pre-Christianity.
Oh, yeah, pre-Christianity. Yeah, I mean, Jesus might have been crucified, but there's no Christianity in 38 CE. This is Rome. This is Rome. I mean, of course, you know, after 70 CE, every single Jew throughout the Roman Empire had to pay a tax, a fiscus Judaicus, for what happened in Judea. Jews cannot escape their Jewishness wherever they are. And because they cannot escape their Jewishness, many of them lean into their Judean, their Jewish identities, not just in an apologetic way, but in a very proud way. Like, this is who we are. It's circular, of course. This is who we are. And so that's how they're treated. That's how they're treated. So they say, this is who we are. But this dynamic is very resonant for contemporary times. And the way that Jews cope with their very complicated relationship between diaspora and Judean Jews, between Jews and Greeks, right? The way that Jews cope with these complicated relationships is they look back at their scriptures creatively, and they're looking for lessons that tell them something about how to live their lives in their own day. And so the experimenting, the playfulness of Second Temple Judaism, to me, this does not undermine anything about how I live as an observant Jew. It's nourishing, it's inspiring, and I also think it's normative. This is what it is to be a Jew today.
It's so comforting to hear the way you describe it. You know, there's a part of me, and I've always been kind of a curious cat and like looking, you know, going down all these rabbit holes. And one of the rabbit holes I find most frightening is the rabbit hole of what was Judaism like in early Judaism, in ancient Judaism, whatever you want to call them, the Second Temple period. Because there's a part, I think there's a very conscious effort that began already in the times of the Mishnah and the Talmud to superimpose the Judaism that they had in that period onto earlier periods, onto Avraham Avinu, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and they knew they were doing it. It was conscious, but it's come to a point now where, like, you'll have children's books that, show period wearing, like bekishas and strimals and contemporary Hasidic wear in the Second Temple period, which to me would make me nervous because it's like, what don't they want me to know? They don't want me to know that really this was, God forbid, fabricated. What they don't want me to know is that it was, God forbid, invented. And what you're saying, and what I really think that you model and you so passionately articulate, is that no, this was not invented, but like, you keep using the word playfulness. Like, this is the very product of Judaism. This is the very focus of negotiating our particularity, a word you don't love, our electedness throughout history. But let me come back to a question, and I'm curious how you weigh in on that. Meaning, if so much of the preservation of Judaism has to do with what we've accrued over exiles and different periods, does it ever feel to you just like a cultural club? Like, where does the divine imperative come to you from? The way it's phrased to me by the person who is really my partner in everything we do in 1840, and this question erodes it gnaws at him. It sucks away the life of his Jewish commitment. Is he always says, it feels to me like the Raccoon Lodge. Like, we're just a really big country club. We're just a really big, we're just like a nice cultural movement, but we don't have any claim to divinity any more than, forget other religions, but than any other cultural association, than whatever civic club, the bowling league you belong to. So where do you find the divinity, if not through tracing a direct line of practice from 2022 to the Second Temple period, that what I do now is exactly modeled by what was done then? Where do you find the divinity in where you do now if that line doesn't in fact extend sequentially?
I mean, that is the biggest question. And I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer, but I think, again, we have to ask the question. And I think the question really is, what does it mean to be authentic, right? What does it mean to practice in a way that connects you back to the divine intent as it was given, if you believe in Revelation, at Sinai? And so I do think here it might be useful to distinguish between belief and practice, and not to get too trite, but I think that the story of the oven of Aknai is a great example of the ways in which the rabbis really leaned into the idea that they had the agency to do radical new things. The rabbis self-consciously do that. They know that, the way that they're practicing Judaism is not the way that the Israelites in the time of Moshe practiced, whatever it is, you would call it Israelitism. And so the rabbis are sensitive to that. And also the Jews in the Second Temple period are. And I think that the most important period of Jewish history is also the darkest one, and that's the Babylonian exile, right? The way that they come back is not the way that they left. We kind of have a sense of what life is like, or at least what the prophetic divine expectations are of the people as they depart Judea in 597 to 586. Suddenly they come back and it's like, I don't want to make a bad analogy to someone who returns from captivity, but there are contemporary stories of someone being in captivity for years and they come back, they're a different person, right? There's literally a new person that you're dealing with after trauma. And I do think, I'm not a psychologist, but I do think that when the Judeans, of course, it's a new generation after 70 or so years, they come back and you're dealing with a new community, not just physically, right? They're the children or grandchildren of those who left, but also just psychologically and in terms of how they interrelate with God and their self-understanding. And so this is the darkest period of our history. It's also the most transitional, right? Some say that the synagogue was invented in Babylonian exile. Who knows? But the point is that something changes. And in the Second Temple period, the Jews Judeans, again, imbue themselves with the agency to sort of take matters into their own hands and develop their practices in a way that just doesn't exist beforehand. I can't give you the answer, the key to the mystery of the Babylonian exile, but something seriously changes. And that's why I think, is our belief so embedded in practice? Like, is who we are embedded in what we do? Maybe not. Maybe we can say, well, that is artificial. It doesn't come from Sinai. It doesn't come from God. Okay, that developed over time, beginning in the early years of the Second Temple period. The rabbis developed it further. Right? It doesn't have to go back to God. Let's focus on belief, though, right? Because there is a continuum there. The idea that Israel was chosen, that goes back, that obviously predates the Babylonian exile, obviously predates, maybe even the First Temple. It is so ancient. It's the heart, it's the core, it's the everything. That's the continuum for me that makes me feel connected to everything. It's the chosenness, it's the election, it's not the practice. So yes, I keep kosher and I live as an observant Jew, and I do that to identify myself with this community, but the community for me, the value lies not in the practice, it lies in this special relationship that we have with God that is characterized by mystery.
I was thinking, I don't even know if I'm going to go forward with this next question. Like, this would be insane for me to ask you, but I'm thinking about going, and if you don't like it, I could absolutely cut it out. But I'm looking at you now. We're not sharing the video for this, though we certainly could. It's a lovely video. It looks to me, and this is the part that's insane, that you cover your hair, and you clearly are dressed in the normal standards of contemporary Orthodox modesty. I'm curious, almost from like a personal level, like, you sacrifice a lot for this idea of being connected to this initial election. And why, if you don't have a more invested framing of the practice in the way that you're describing it, then aren't you fatigued? There are so many other communities that ask less of you. So why is Malka Simkovich I could preserve the election idea, which is a beautiful and very divine idea, by doing so much less? So what keeps you going if you know there are so many other alternatives? Like, why not just and I'm not asking you nor encouraging you to tear off your sheitel and but what situates you in the Orthodox community when it is fatiguing, when it is demanding so much of you? Like, why not switch? And maybe this has to do with a little bit, you did maybe evolve a little bit from you mentioned that,
Rebbetzin Tzvei was your
Chumash teacher. I don't know who your children's Chumash teacher is, but did you evolve? Is that part of that conscious evolution? And what keeps you going today if your idea is hinged on something so essential that could be manifest in so many other ways?
Wow. I'm going to try to answer this. It's very hard to get personal on a podcast that's going to be disseminated so publicly. So I have to be careful with how I move forward. I don't think that halachic practice is meaningless. I just don't think that every halacha is inherently meaningful. Does that make sense?
Tell me more.
The meaning of halachic observance doesn't lie in sort of this inherent, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's inherent meaning, but there's social meaning, and that's not nothing, right? And by social, I don't just mean, I'm doing it because everyone else does it. It does connect me to a community, I think, in a higher transcendent way, I think in an ancient way. And that doesn't mean that it's taking me back to Sinai. I'm going to say something very cynical, but then I'm going to try to couch it in maybe less cynical terms. I like to talk about from points. From points is a social currency that I use in my world. When I wear a sheitel, which I'm wearing now, and I'm, wearing a certain long sleeve shirt or whatever, skirts always, those are from points that I'm accruing, and then I spend them. And I would never, oh gosh, I hope my rabbi's not going to be listening to this, I would never get an invitation to speak on my shul. Like, I just gave a shiur yesterday at my shul, Sunday morning. I would never get that invitation if I didn't have from points to spend. And I wouldn't be able to stand in shul on a Sunday morning and make a reference to the New Testament or Jesus, although that costs more points. So you have to be careful. You can't spend all your from points because you can't go into debt. You can't go into debt. And so my world is very transactional. I mean, I hate to break it to you all listeners, but your lives are transactional too. We all do this even if we don't know it. I work very hard to accrue my from points, and I spend them very carefully. And I don't feel bad about this. In other words, I don't think that this is some sort of cynical, empty, just tricky way of moving about, sinisterly concealing my true beliefs, but, hoping not to get kicked out of my community. But I do think that I dress a certain way, I speak a certain way, and act a certain way. I send my children also to a school that's, pretty centrist Orthodox. So these are the points that I accrue, and I'm very cautious and careful about how I spend them. I try not to go into debt. Now, that said, I don't think that these things are just superficial. It's very hard for me to talk about this further because there's also the whole gender piece, which I do think is very modern. I actually don't see it as being like inherent to halacha in the most sort of timeless sense. I think it's very social, contemporary, and I also think a lot needs to be changed. So when we're talking about things that women do, right, in capital letters, there's a lot of change that I want to see, that I hope to see. And so that is sort of its own thing. But when it comes to me practicing as a halachic Jew, it does connect me to my ancestors, again, not to pre-exilic revelation at all, personally. It does connect me to something higher and transcendent, but I don't think that there is inherent meaning in a lot of these things. This is a very, very hard question. I think I'm going to stop there.
No, I appreciate it. I do like the distinction that you are making. I would paint it not as broadly, but I do think there are two different systems that are both at play that have an overlap. There is one system which is, in terms of our practice, that is from points, that's much more contemporary, socializing you to a contemporary Jewish community. And there is another set of halachic practice, and there is an overlap in these two circles, that is socializing you to a divine idea. Keeping kosher social, there's an experiential component, even in the frustration, like, oh, I can't eat anything here. Like, that frustration has a divinity in it. I think it is by design, some of the frustration. But I think where some people's frustration, and when they look at halacha as overly taxing or Jewish practice as overly exhausting, it is when they confuse the two or don't see the purpose of the two. I think there's a purpose to from points also, like on the communal level. If everyone is just kind of, practicing what connects them to the divine idea, I think a lot of the locus of our communal practice would be frayed or would erode quite quickly. I just want to say, you paused fairly quickly there, and your mind is really straying elsewhere. Like, you look like there's an emotional heaviness to what you just shared. What's going through your head right now?
I don't even know if I should answer that. Look, this is a very hard thing to talk about. I'm happy to talk about it on an academic sort of intellectual level. But, I have a family and I have children who go to Ari Crown Hebrew Day School. I have to be very careful about what I say for their sake. Not that I'm so important that anybody is really going to be sharing this with the principal of Ari Crown. I'm pretty sure he has other things to do. This is just,
Let me phrase it this way. In your home, the way you ground your faith, does it bother you that you send your kids to a school that may do it in a different way? Is that something, if you were in charge of a school, would you teach a 7-year-old differently?
No, I think that as our brains grow and as we mature, we become prepared for certain questions that young children are not prepared for. But I'm very particular about this. I hide a lot from my children. Topics such as the Holocaust, I'm very intentional. Not that I can control it perfectly, but I'm very careful about what they have access to, what information they have access to, at what stage. I'm very protective. And I think that developmentally, a 5 or 6-year-old doesn't need to know. And again, I know many educators disagree with me, but my 6-year-old just asked me how many, he heard about the Holocaust, of course it was Yom HaShoah, and he said how many Jews were killed, and I said many Jews were killed. And he said, I need a number. And I said, it was a very big number, Gabrielle. And he said, was it 2,000? And I said, it was 2,000 or maybe even more than 2,000. I'm not going to tell him 6 million. What kind of number is that for a 6-year-old, right? How could even an adult can't comprehend what 6 million is? I think that there's a certain easing into a nuanced, complicated religious life. I'm on the arc too, and I'm middle-aged, right? So I think that as we move, we have to be moved by our mentors gently and slowly. I'm in no rush to talk to my children about how I read Midrash, and honestly, who cares? Because for me, again, I want to marginalize all of that authorship business. We put so much weight on the question of who wrote this text or that text, and then the house of cards falls. And then, people fall with it. I think if we centralize the fact that God chose us for a special relationship, we can't understand what that means, but we have to thank Hashem for it every day. I can tell that to my 6-year-old. He gets something from that. And then when he's 10 and when he's 15 and 20, he'll reapproach that idea in new ways. I'm very controlling, though, with how I talk about it.
This has been absolutely fascinating, and the fact that you're willing to share and did share means a great deal. I'm curious, as somebody so immersed in the second Temple period, which I do find find so absolutely fascinating. What are the texts and studies that you go to nourish your own religious commitment? Do you go to the academic study of Second Temple? Is your academic life nourishing your personal religious life, or is it a separate set of texts, so to speak?
That's a great question. And I've just recently realized I've never been trained in theology. I've just been sort of pretending, right? Like we talked at the beginning of the hour, of people who just sort of fake it till they make it. And certainly in my space of Catholic Jewish dialogue, I have to pretend to have some facility in the world of Jewish theology. But I only realized, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, that I need to formally educate myself when it comes to contemporary theology. And so I've bought I wouldn't say I have a library, but I've bought books. And my Friday night reading is now contemporary Jewish theological, writers. And I've really been drawn to Tamar Ross. I mean, who understands what she says? The few times that I get it, though, I'm just blown away. So there are writers that I'm still sort of encountering as a new reader. And I would say she's probably at the top of that list. So I do need to do more of that, I think, to really sort of ask those questions, but also familiarize myself with there are people out there who are asking these same questions as well.
I cannot thank you enough. Really, just the work that you do is absolutely fascinating. I hope that someday the contribution, even though it doesn't appear in that volume, appears in some other place, reflecting on the world that you study and the world that you currently inhabit, and figuring out a way to create a bridge between those two worlds is some of the biggest important questions that we're all doing in some way or another in our own lives. I always wrap up my interviews with more rapid fire questions. My first question, which is almost the easiest, is if somebody wants to learn more about this ancient world that you are describing, give me some of the books. This is specifically for people within the Orthodox world, and myself included. I look at this, academic world of this period as being very frightful, very like faith eroding rather than faith building. So I'm wondering, what would you recommend for somebody who wants to understand and really reach out and connect and touch with that ancient world of Judaism that you study every single day?
I'm going to do the thing that is the most obnoxious practice of academic.
Recommend your own book. Do it.
Exactly.
I usually don't
let people do it if the whole conversation, kind of circled around their book, but we didn't do that this time. So you have earned that there should be another currency. It's not frum points, it's like academic points.
Right.
And academics can spend their points by recommending their own book at times. You can't use it too many. Where should we start? Tell me.
Okay, so thank you. That's very gracious. My book is Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures and Stories that Shaped Early Judaism. But of course, there are many, many amazing scholars of this period. Actually, Larry Schiffman comes to mind, Lawrence Schiffman, Isaiah Gaffney, Eric Gruen. By the way, I feel bad because now I'm naming men. There are many women scholars as well who are experts and wonderful writers as well. I would caution listeners from over-focusing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are the worst thing to have happened to the Second Temple period because everyone knows about them, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are sectarian and extreme and represent about 100 people. So if you want to learn about this period, don't go to the Dead Sea Scrolls right away. That's not representative. It's like going to like Kiryas Yoel and saying, I've just learned about American Judaism. Don't do it. I mean, do it, but do it at the
part
last
of the story,
stage.
but
Right.
It's not the whole story.
Exactly. So there is a lot out there.
Yeah, shout out to our listeners in Kiryas Yoel. For real. We have listeners, thank God, all over. But yeah, and no one community, especially a more sectarian or a more, what we would describe now as extreme community, is representative of what's going on with everybody. And I think that's a fair warning and analogy. My next question, and this is always strange to ask, and so many of our guests already have PhDs, but my question is, if somebody gave you a great sum of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical or as long as you needed to go back to school and get a second PhD, you already have one, my lord, covering all of your responsibilities that you need, what do you think the subject and title of that PhD would be?
Not even a question. It would be musicology. It would be 19th century music theory. No question about it.
I love the surprising answers. That did surprise me. 19th century musicology.
Well, my BA is in music theory, and I almost got a PhD. I mean, I almost applied. I did not apply, but I almost applied for PhDs in musicology. This was my big love love as an undergraduate, and I gave it up, and I really hope one day to go back to it.
Can you play an instrument?
I am a pianist, yes.
Fascinating. Okay, I know precious little about musicology, except when like
Me too.
it sometimes comes up in Jewish thought, like interesting, but
That's absolutely fascinating. My last question, I'm always curious about people's schedules. What time do you go to sleep and what time do you wake up in the morning?
That is such an interesting question, and I've never been asked it. Can I just say what I want to be like, and then I'll tell you what I am like?
please.
I want to be the person who gets up at 4:45 a.m., who has a bowl of avocados,
Yeah.
and it's like set on a windowsill by the sunlight, and then another bowl of lemons, and like
Yeah.
it's in like a wooden bowl. It
The
can't be-
hard-boiled egg sliced up. Yeah.
Right. And then like I want to be that person that writes for 2 hours, and then like by 7 a.m. the writing is done, the house is clean, the children like,
Better
you know.
Focus on your correspondence or something. You have like 2 hours like
Right.
set aside.
Right, with like
Yeah.
a very fancy pen.
Yeah.
I'm not that person. My habits are horrible. I go to sleep after midnight. I mean, I go to sleep between, I guess, 12:15 to 12:30. That's like normal. Sometimes it's later. And I wake up. I struggle out of bed between 6:30 and 6:45. This is bad. I don't recommend this to anyone. I really, really want to get up, and I want a bowl of lemons in my house. So if anyone can do that for me, my birthday is in September, and I want to live that life. Yeah.
Malka, I cannot thank you enough for sharing, for coming on. It means so much to me. And again, our listeners will definitely appreciate it. Your scholarship, your stories, your experiences are incredibly fascinating, uplifting, and inspiring. Thank you again so much for today. I don't know if you're even still listening there. That was one of the longest introductions that I ever did. So I forgive anybody who desperately wants to skip this outro. You have my permission. I think the very end of this interview hit very hard and addressed some of the questions that we explored in the early beginning. Not everyone's going to like them. Some people might downright hate them or call them, that they're outside of the canon, heresy, whatever you want to call it. But I do think it gives a path. Number one, I found it so deeply moving that she's able to really understand what early Judaism looked like and that our traditions really stretch back all the way. To me, that is a deep, deep comfort and one that I hope to explore with more and focus on more in the future. But secondly, I think the admission at the end of what is sociologically motivated. Not everything that I do that is sociologically motivated am I cynical about. Some of it I am. Some of it I don't take all that seriously. But any movement, any community is going to have sociological elements around it, surrounding it, preserving it. And that's a part of how we stay together as a people, as Knesset Yisroel. And I think it was very brave, very courageous, and extraordinarily honest of her to talk about that and share that. And that, while not being the capital T truth, that could be the lowercase t truth for people. That the way that they're able to feel comfort and authenticity in their Jewish life is knowing what is theologically, divinely motivated and what's maybe sociologically motivated. You could be a good Jew and not know how to play floor hockey despite what nearly every single modern Orthodox Jewish school tells you. There are things that we do that are sociologically motivated, and it doesn't need to erode the divinity that is otherwise grounding our faith and practice. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our team member and friend, Dina Emerson. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Again, that voicemail is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18 followed by the word 40, FORTY.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.